Hello, 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 and welcome to part 1 of a planned 6-part series in which I will dive into the Creepypasta Iceberg, specifically the one made by Reddit user Avarg Skeletorium. For those of you who do not know what an iceberg is, it is a chart typically surrounding a specific form of media or a game or something, and it's separated into typically about 6 different layers. And the top layer is the most popular, well-known, and in creepy terms, often the least creepy, although that is, of course, entirely subjective. And then they get more obscure and potentially more creepy the further down you go. In part 1, we will just be exploring the top layer, which is the tip of the iceberg, but do not worry, for there is plenty of scares to be had regardless. Creepypasta is one of those internet things that has always interested me. Even though a lot of it tends to be, self-insert trash, there is always good stuff with the bad. And even with the bad stuff, a lot of them are good for laughs. So, without further ado, let's dip our toes into the darkness with the tip of the Creepypasta Iceberg. The first creepypasta on this iceberg is the Russian sleep experiment, one of my personal favorites out of this top layer. So the basic synopsis and setup is that in 1947 Russia, there's a military experiment with 5 prisoners who were deemed enemies of the state, and they were to be put in a chamber with a stimulant gas pumped into the chamber that would prevent them from sleeping for 30 days. These prisoners were also promised freedom upon completion of the experiment, as a reward for going through with the experiment, which is why they presumably agreed to this, despite it not being a good idea. For the first 5 days, everything is as normal. They're talking with each other, doing whatever they can do to pass the time. They even speak to the researchers via some one-way glass windows. On day 9 is when we get our first turn into darkness with this experiment. One subject begins to scream for hours on end, while the other subjects do not react to his outburst. Eventually, the screaming gets the better of him, and he tears his vocal cords, going mute. Eventually, a second one starts screaming, and around that same time, the others begin to block off the researchers from watching them by pasting torn-out pages of books with their own feces over the windows. Several days pass by, and the researchers cannot see inside. During this time, there's also silence from the chamber. There's no sound. Eventually, the researchers think to use the intercom to see if they were even still alive, and they receive a short, compliant response from one of the subjects. On the 15th day, the researchers turn off the gas and open the chamber. The subjects panic at the loss of the gas because they are afraid of falling asleep. There are 4 surviving subjects at this point. The 4 survivors have performed severe self-mutilation and disembowelment. They've torn off sections of their skin and muscle. They've removed important abdominal organs. They've performed self-cannibalism and cannibalism on the dead one. There's 4 inches of blood and water on the floor because they clogged the drains with flesh from the dead subject. It's a very gruesome sight. The subjects do not want to leave the chamber. They violently fight against this. They beg for the stimulant. They even go so far as to murder one of the soldiers and severely injure another one for trying to remove them from the chamber, but they are eventually removed. Upon removal, it's discovered that they have developed extreme strength, crazy resistance to anesthesia and sedatives. They've remained alive despite lethal injuries, and they have a desperate desire to be awake and for the stimulant to be back in their system. It is discovered when one of them dies by falling asleep that they will die if they fall asleep. Against the will of the researchers, but by order of the military who's, overseeing all of this, the 3 survivors are returned to the chamber, after some care for their injuries. During this next period of time, some EEG monitors show brain death at several points. It's also noted that one died before the chamber was even sealed because he fell asleep, and the only subject who still had a voice screamed to be immediately sealed in because he didn't want to fall asleep. The military also had 3 researchers stay within the chamber. One immediately killed the commander and the mute subject, and the other researchers fled the room. There's only one survivor at this point, and a terrified researcher who does not want to be locked in a room with what he calls monsters that can no longer be called people. He's desperate for answers. He asks what the subject was. The subject smiles and explains that he and the other subjects are an inherent evil inside the human mind that is kept in check by the act of sleeping. The researcher pauses for a moment. He considers this answer, and then he shoots the prisoner in the heart. As the subject is dying on the floor, he mutters his final words. So nearly free. So that was the Russian sleep experiment. It's the first creepypasta we're going into in this Iceberg, and it's quite the thing, isn't it, huh? I have some thoughts on it. Overall, I do think it's a pretty good story. You'll also notice as we go on, a lot of creepypastas aren't really well written, so the fact that this one is believable enough and, well written generally is pretty good. Maybe the only complaint I have mainly would just be all the weird superpowers they seem to get upon leaving the chamber for the first time. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It kind of breaks the illusion of it being a real thing if they're suddenly super strong and they have all this resist and all this stuff. They basically have superpowers, which doesn't make sense because realistically they would probably be pretty weak and not doing well physically. I don't buy it. The rest of it I think is pretty cool, and I think it's a pretty effective ending. It's also gone on to inspire plenty of short film adaptations, several novels, I think a full movie as well. Overall, it's a pretty respected one, even outside of the general creepypasta fandom. One more thing I'd like to talk about before we move on to the next story is the picture that is commonly associated with this, and it's on screen now. Pretty freaky picture, and it's, of course in the story supposed to be one of the victims from the experiment. It's actually a Halloween prop called Spasm. It was made by Morbid Enterprises for the 2005 Halloween season. And that specific photo seems to originate from I Read Creepypasta's first and most popular video about the legend, where he used a darker edit of the picture and on a bed with a little light. And that's the origin of the pictures. It's this Halloween prop. So, not a real photo of a real person, just a Halloween prop. Thought I'd throw that out there. Yeah, overall, a pretty strong start, I feel, to this Iceberg, and it was written by a Creepypasta wiki user by the name of Orange Soda. On to the next one.